Jacelyn Adler tightened her grip on the pitchfork, her heart pounding as she watched the sleek black SUV kick up dust on the gravel road leading to her ranch. She knew exactly who it was, the billionaire who thought he could buy her home out from under her. The door of the SUV opened, and out stepped Xander Thorne. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an air of effortless power, he looked completely out of place in his tailored suit against the backdrop of her run-down barn and the crumbling fences. His piercing blue eyes scanned the property before landing on her. "You're trespassing," Jacelyn called out, planting her boots firmly in the dirt. Xander's lips tugged into something dangerously close to amusement. "Actually," he said smoothly, "I own this land now." Her stomach dropped, but she refused to show it. "Not to me, you don't." He took a few steps closer, unbothered by the dust clinging to his expensive shoes. "I bought it fair and square, Jacelyn." The bank was more than happy to sell. Her jaw clenched. She knew the ranch was in trouble, but she'd been fighting to keep it afloat. Her grandfather had built this place from the ground up, and she wasn't about to let some billionaire with too much money and too little heart take it away. "I'm not leaving," she said defiantly. Xander arched a brow. "You don't have a choice. Try and make me." There was a flicker of something in his gaze, annoyance, intrigue, maybe both. He exhaled sharply, then glanced around at the neglected property. The barn roof sagged, the fences were barely holding together, and the fields were overgrown. It was a mess, but to Jacelyn it was home. "Why are you so determined to stay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She lifted her chin. "Because this ranch isn't just land, it's my family's legacy. My grandfather built it, my parents ran it, I won't let it die." Xander studied her for a long moment. Then, to her shock, he said, "Fine." Her eyes narrowed. "Fine. I'll give you 30 days. He crossed his arms, his tailored suit stretching across his broad chest. "Prove to me this ranch is worth saving. If you can turn a profit, I'll reconsider what to do with it." Jacelyn's pulse thundered. This was a trick, it had to be. "And if I can't," she asked, "then you leave, no arguments." She should have said no. She should have told him to get back in his fancy car and drive away, but this was her only chance to save the ranch. "Deal," she said before she could second-guess herself. Xander's lips curled into a knowing expression. "Then I'll be staying here to oversee it." Her stomach flipped. "You're what?" "If I'm giving you 30 days, I want to see the progress myself." He gestured toward the crumbling house at the center of the ranch. "I assume there's a spare room," Jacelyn wanted to scream. This man had just turned her life upside down, and now he wanted to live under the same roof. But she didn't back down. "Fine," she said tightly, "but don't expect special treatment." Xander chuckled. "Oh, Jacelyn." "I wouldn't dream of it." As he moved past her toward the house, she had the sinking feeling she'd just made a deal with the devil. A devil with impossibly blue eyes and a voice that made her pulse skip. This was going to be a disaster. Jacelyn stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing off a plate with water so lukewarm it barely did the job. The plumbing had been acting up for weeks, but repairs weren't exactly in the budget. Now, thanks to an infuriating billionaire, she had a houseguest who probably expected a 5-star experience. Xander Thorne leaned against the doorframe, exuding an air of effortless control. Even in his dress shirt, with his sleeves pushed up to reveal strong forearms, he looked completely out of place in the worn-down farmhouse. The contrast between them was almost laughable, yet he didn't seem uncomfortable. If anything, he looked amused. "You're staring," she muttered, setting the plate down with more force than necessary. "Just taking in my surroundings," he replied smoothly. "I expected worse." She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "That's supposed to be a compliment." He glanced around the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, the dim lighting, the creaky wooden floorboards. "It's lived in." Jacelyn rolled her eyes. "If you're looking for luxury, you're in the wrong place. I can see that." His gaze flickered toward the ceiling as a faint creak echoed from the old beams. "I assume that sound isn't the house about to collapse." "It's settling," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Xander pushed off the doorframe and stepped closer, his presence filling the small space between them. "You're going to need help if you want to keep this place running." "I don't need your help. You need someone's." She hated that he wasn't wrong. With only a handful of ranch hands who worked when they could and no steady income, she didn't have the resources to turn things around overnight. He studied her for a moment, then nodded as if making a decision. "I'll work." Jacelyn blinked. "Excuse me? You need help." "I need to see this place succeed if I'm going to reconsider my investment. Seems logical." She scoffed. "You, working on a ranch, you probably don't even know how to saddle a horse." A glint of something unreadable passed through his eyes. "Try me." She didn't trust him, not one bit. But if he was serious, she could use the extra set of hands. "Fine," she said begrudgingly, "but don't expect me to go easy on you." Xander only gave a slight nod, as if accepting a challenge. The next morning, Jacelyn wasted no time putting him to work. She handed him a rake and pointed at the horse stalls. "Start mucking." He glanced at the task, then back at her. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "A little," she admitted. To her surprise, he didn't complain. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. It was almost entertaining watching a man used to boardrooms and tailored suits deal with the grime and sweat of ranch life. By midday, his once pristine shirt was streaked with dust, his hair slightly tousled. Jacelyn leaned against the fence, watching as he led one of the horses toward the pasture. He was clumsy but determined, adjusting quickly to each task. When he caught her watching, that unreadable expression returned. "You expected me to quit by now," she shrugged. "Wouldn't have blamed you." He stopped a few feet away, his gaze locking onto hers. "I don't quit easily." Something in his tone sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She quickly turned away, focusing on the ranch instead of the man who was steadily becoming less of an enemy and more of an enigma. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat on the porch steps. The air held the faint scent of hay and earth, the quiet hum of crickets filling the space between them. "You could sell," Xander said suddenly. "Start fresh somewhere else." Jacelyn traced a finger along the edge of her boot. "And do what? Work in an office?" "Live in a city where the sky is blocked by buildings. This ranch is my home. It's all I have left of my family." He didn't reply right away. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "You're willing to fight for it." "Of course I am," he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I don't get it," she frowned. "What don't you get?" "Attachment to a place. I've moved every few years, lived in penthouses, traveled constantly. I can work from anywhere." Jacelyn studied him, realizing something. "You don't have a home, do you?" His expression flickered, something unreadable passing through his gaze. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I have properties." "That's not the same thing." He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. For the first time, Jacelyn saw something beyond the billionaire businessman, a man who, for all his wealth, might not have ever had a place that truly felt like his. She shifted slightly, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. This arrangement was supposed to be about saving the ranch. But something told her it was going to change more than just the land beneath their feet. Dawn broke over the ranch, casting golden light across the land as Jacelyn saddled one of the horses. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh earth and hay. She worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced ease, but she wasn't alone. Xander stood a few feet away, rolling his shoulders as though trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. His usual polished demeanor was gone. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled, and there was a streak of dirt along his forearm from the previous day's work. He was adjusting. She hated how much she noticed. Jacelyn focused on tightening the saddle's straps. "You're riding today." Xander arched a brow, his posture shifting. "I assumed I was just fixing fences." She gave him a pointed glance. "You said you wanted to help. That means learning everything." His gaze flickered toward the horse, assessing. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't entirely confident either. That small crack in his usual unshakable presence made something tighten in her chest. Jacelyn handed him the reins, stepping back. "Mount up." Xander moved forward, adjusting his grip. His movements were careful but hesitant. He was a man who mastered everything he touched, and yet this was unfamiliar territory. He swung himself up into the saddle, but the moment he settled, the horse shifted beneath him. His hands tightened on the reins, his back going rigid. Jacelyn exhaled. "Relax." "You're holding too tight." His jaw flexed, but he loosened his grip slightly. The horse settled, sensing the shift in his energy. Jacelyn walked beside him as they moved toward the open pasture. "You've never done this before, have you?" "I've closed billion-dollar deals, navigated power struggles, and handled corporate takeovers. This shouldn't be difficult." She bit back a laugh. "A horse isn't a business transaction, it's a partnership. You can't control it through sheer force of will." Xander remained silent, his expression unreadable, but he adjusted his posture, following her lead. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of hoofbeats filling the space between them. The ranch stretched out around them, endless fields of golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. Jacelyn stole a glance at him. The usual tension in his shoulders had eased. He looked different here, less like a man who owned the world and more like someone trying to find his place in it. She averted her gaze, focusing on the pasture ahead. When they reached the far fence line, she dismounted, grabbing a tool belt from where she'd left it earlier. "Time to work." Xander followed, his movements more fluid as he slid from the saddle. He rolled his neck, stretching muscles that weren't used to riding. Jacelyn handed him a hammer. "You're fixing that post." He took it without question, stepping forward. The wood was weathered, leaning slightly from years of wear. As he worked, Jacelyn adjusted another section of the fence, keeping an eye on him. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was paying attention, learning. Sweat gathered at his brow, his shirt sticking to his back as the sun rose higher. He was out of his element, but he wasn't complaining. When the fence was finally reinforced, he straightened, exhaling. Jacelyn rested her hands on her hips. "Not bad." His gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "I told you I don't quit." Something passed between them, unspoken but heavy. The wind rustled the grass, but neither moved. Jacelyn broke the moment, turning back toward the horses. "Come on, we've got more work to do." Xander followed, but the air between them had shifted. That evening, as they returned to the house, the sky painted in hues of orange and deep blue, Jacelyn went straight to the kitchen. She pulled ingredients from the cupboards, moving with ease, but she was keenly aware of Xander's presence as he leaned against the counter. He watched her, arms crossed, his usual controlled expression softer than before. "You cook?" he asked. Jacelyn glanced at him. "I live on a ranch. What do you think?" His lips twitched, but he didn't argue. She worked in silence, the smell of grilled steak and roasted vegetables filling the small space. Xander didn't offer to help, but he didn't leave either. When she finally set 2 plates on the table, he sat across from her. They ate in silence at first, but then Xander set his fork down. "You didn't have to cook for me," Jacelyn shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "You worked today, you earned it." Something passed through his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. They finished the meal, the silence between them not uncomfortable but charged with something unspoken. When they stepped onto the porch after dinner, the stars had begun to emerge, scattered across the sky like diamonds. Xander leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I never stopped to look at the stars." Jacelyn tilted her head. "Why not?" he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Too much to do, too many things to handle," she studied him. "And yet, here you are." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Something had changed between them. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. And that terrified her more than losing everything. Jacelyn stood by the paddock, her hands gripping the wooden fence as she stared out over the land she had fought so hard to keep. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth from the storm that had passed through the night before. Beyond the rolling fields, the horizon stretched endlessly, the sky painted in muted shades of early morning light. Xander stood beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers. He had abandoned his usual polished appearance. His shirt was dusted with dirt from the morning chores. His sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms that had, to her utter surprise, taken to the work as though he had spent years doing it. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them no longer felt like a battle. It was something else now, something heavy and unspoken, pressing against the space between them like the weight of a confession waiting to be made. The past few weeks had changed everything. What had started as an arrangement built on stubbornness and necessity had shifted into something far more complicated. He had come here with the intention of taking this place from her, but instead he had become part of it. She could feel him watching her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "There's something about this place," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. She turned her head slightly, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. "You finally admitting you like it here?" His lips curved, but there was no arrogance in it, no challenge. "Just something softer, something real. I'm admitting that I understand why you fought so hard for it." He gestured to the land before them, the worn fences, the fields that had once seemed destined for failure. "It's not just property. It's something bigger than that." Jacelyn swallowed, her grip tightening on the fence. She had spent so long believing no one else could see what she saw that no one else would ever understand why this place mattered. And yet here he was, a man who had once seen this land as nothing more than an investment, now speaking of it like it meant something, like it meant everything. She turned fully to face him, the wind catching loose strands of her hair. "What happens now?" Xander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a folded document. Jacelyn's stomach twisted. "I had my legal team draft this last night," he said, holding it out to her. "It's a full transfer of ownership. The ranch is yours, completely." Her breath caught. She stared at the papers as if they might disappear if she blinked too fast. She had fought for this land with everything she had prepared herself for the possibility of losing, but she had never expected this. Never imagined that the man who had once threatened to take it all away would be the one to give it back without condition, without hesitation. Her fingers trembled as she took the documents, her eyes scanning the words. It was real, it was legal, it was hers. She looked up at him, searching his face for some kind of explanation. "Why?" Xander held her gaze, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "Because I don't want to take this from you. Because I see what it means to you, and I'd rather see it thrive with you running it than see it turned into something it was never meant to be." Her heart pounded against her ribs. This was more than just a business decision, more than some grand gesture made out of guilt. This was something deeper, something real, something terrifying. She felt her throat tighten, the weight of everything pressing down on her all at once. The past month had been a whirlwind of emotions, of battles fought and lines drawn, but somewhere in the middle of it all, something had shifted. He had changed. She had changed. And now, standing here with the deed to her home in her hands, she realized something else. She didn't want him to leave. Jacelyn took a shaky breath, her fingers curling around the papers. "I don't know what to say." Xander's lips parted slightly, as if he was about to speak, but then he hesitated. His hands flexed at his sides like he was holding something back. Then finally he said, "Say you'll stay." Her breath hitched. She had fought him at every turn, had convinced herself that he was nothing more than an obstacle standing between her and the life she had built. But he wasn't an obstacle. He was a part of it now. She searched his face, seeing something raw in his expression, something he wasn't used to showing, something that looked a lot like love. Jacelyn took a step closer, the space between them vanishing. "You're really letting me keep it?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Xander reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek, his touch lingering. "I was never meant to take it from you." Her chest ached. She had spent so long believing she had to fight for everything alone, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to anymore. She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "Then maybe you should stay too." His breath caught. For the first time since she had met him, Xander Thorne looked truly, completely unguarded. And then, without another word, he closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with everything they hadn't said. Everything they had been too stubborn to admit. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I think I'd like that," he murmured. Jacelyn smiled. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just fighting to hold on to something, she was choosing to let something in. The morning sun cast golden light over the ranch as Jacelyn stepped out onto the porch, the wood cool beneath her bare feet. The land stretched before her, vibrant and alive, as if it too had felt the shift in the air. The weight of uncertainty that had once settled in her chest was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Behind her, the faint creak of the screen door signaled Xander's arrival. He moved beside her, his presence solid and steady. The past few weeks had changed him in ways neither of them had expected. The billionaire who had once seen this place as nothing more than an acquisition now stood beside her, sleeves rolled up, boots covered in dust, belonging in a way she never could have imagined. The ranch was his now too, not by ownership but by choice. Jacelyn turned her head slightly, catching the way his gaze rested on the horizon as if seeing it through new eyes. The quiet between them was comfortable, no longer burdened by what-ifs or unspoken challenges. The fight was over. A gust of wind carried the scent of fresh earth and cut grass as Xander exhaled, his voice quiet but certain. "This place feels different now." Jacelyn studied him, seeing something in his expression she hadn't noticed before. Peace. The sharp edges of control that had once defined him had softened, replaced by something deeper. "It's not the place that changed," she said. His gaze shifted, meeting hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, movement near the barn caught their attention. The ranch hands were already at work preparing for the day's tasks. Repairs still needed to be made, but the land was thriving again. Business had picked up, and for the first time in years, the ranch had a future. A future she wasn't facing alone. Xander stepped away from the porch, moving toward the barn with a confidence that had nothing to do with boardrooms or wealth. Jacelyn followed, watching as he spoke with the workers, his tone direct but not commanding. He had learned the rhythm of this place, had adapted in ways she never would have expected. Watching him now, she realized just how much had shifted between them. Later that afternoon, as the sun hung high overhead, Jacelyn led one of the horses toward the pasture, her thoughts tangled in the reality of what came next. Xander had given her back the ranch, had stayed even when he had no reason to. But what did that mean for them? She hadn't allowed herself to think too far ahead, too afraid of what it might mean if this was temporary. Xander approached, his shirt damp with sweat from hours of working under the sun. He wiped his hands on his jeans, his gaze steady as he watched her. "You're thinking too hard," he said. Jacelyn huffed a quiet laugh. "It's what I do." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "Then let me make it simple." Before she could question him, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Jacelyn's breath caught, her fingers tightening on the reins. Xander didn't drop to one knee, didn't make a grand spectacle of it. He simply held it out, his expression stripped of all pretense. "I didn't plan on this," he admitted, voice steady but weighted with meaning. "I didn't expect to walk onto this ranch and find something I didn't even realize I was missing." Jacelyn swallowed hard, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "I'm not asking because it's the next logical step or because it's what people expect," he continued. "I'm asking because I don't want to leave, because I don't want a life that doesn't include you, this place, everything we've built together." He flipped the box open, revealing a ring that caught the sunlight in brilliant flashes. It was simple, elegant, nothing overly extravagant, but undeniably beautiful. Jacelyn blinked, her throat tight. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore, this was about them. Taking a slow breath, she let go of the reins, stepping forward. Her fingers brushed over his, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "You sure you're ready to trade boardrooms for barns?" Xander's lips twitched, amusement flickering in his gaze. "I think I already have," Jacelyn exhaled, something loosening in her chest. Then, without another word, she took the ring, slid it onto her finger, and let herself believe in something she had never dared to before. A future that wasn't just hers alone. Xander reached for her, pulling her in, and as his lips met hers, she realized something else. Sometimes, the best things in life weren't the ones you fought for. They were the ones you never saw coming. The wedding took place at the ranch, with the sun casting warm, golden light over the rolling fields. Jacelyn had never imagined herself as the kind of woman who dreamed about a wedding, but standing there, surrounded by the land she loved and the man who had somehow become a part of it, she realized how much it all meant. Xander stood at the altar, dressed in a sharp yet understated suit that still somehow made him look like he belonged in a boardroom. But there was no city skyline behind him today. No towering buildings or flashing lights, just the endless expanse of sky, the scent of fresh earth, and the quiet hum of the wind through the trees. As she walked down the aisle, her dress a flowing white that moved with the breeze, she saw something she had never seen before in his eyes. Not just love, but a kind of peace, a certainty that hadn't been there when he first arrived. Xander had never been a man who let himself be tied down to places, to commitments, to anything that wasn't on his terms, and yet here he was waiting for her, choosing this life, this ranch, this future. When she reached him, he took her hands, his touch warm and steady. The vows were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. There were no empty promises, no overly grand declarations, just honesty. Xander promised to fight for what mattered. She promised to never let him forget why they had fought in the first place. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Xander pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her lips that was slow and filled with everything he couldn't say in words. The ranch hands cheered, the small gathering of friends and family clapped, and the horses in the nearby pasture gave a few well-timed neighs as if they, too, approved. Later, as the evening stretched on and the reception carried into the night, Jacelyn found herself standing just outside the barn, staring up at the sky. The stars were brilliant, unfiltered by city lights, scattered across the heavens like tiny sparks. Xander stepped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder. She sighed, leaning back into him. "You're really here to stay?" His grip tightened slightly. "I told you I don't quit." Jacelyn smiled, closing her eyes for a moment. "I know." The warmth of his breath against her skin sent a shiver through her, not from cold, but from the sheer reality of it all. He was hers now, just as much as she was his. And not because of some contract or deal, but because they had chosen each other. As the laughter from their guests echoed from the barn, the music playing softly in the background, Jacelyn turned in his arms, looking up at him. "You still think about the life you left behind?" she asked. Xander considered her for a moment, then shook his head. "No. This is the life I was meant to have." She didn't need to hear anything else. As the night stretched on, they danced beneath the stars, surrounded by the land that had once nearly torn them apart, but had instead brought them together. And for the first time in her life, Jacelyn knew, without a doubt, that she had everything she would ever need.